About Amenemhotep said that he eliminated the sin in the country, recovered captured by one city from another and made them know their boundaries. But the same was also said about Senusert who reigned a century later. And under Amenemhotep and at the end of the reign of Senusert, some arches portrayed on the walls of their tombs the battle between the Egyptians, up to the siege of the fortresses, following the example of their proprietors of the Shi dynasty. The fear of reprisals was so acute that one courtier, named Sinuhet, who was walking with the future Senusert in the Libyan campaign, only after hearing about the death of Amenemhotep, from one thought of a possible distemper after the death of the king, immediately fled from the camp of the prince in Syria. This is described by his artistically worked biography, the so-called The Story of Sinuheta. There is no reason to doubt the possibility of the told incident. The time of the greatest power of state power in the Middle Kingdom coincides with the rule of Amenemhotep III. Little is known about his long reign, in spite of the fact that many monuments have survived from these years. He alone left the structure, which can be compared with the monuments of the time of the Old Kingdom. At the very entrance to the land of the lake Fayum, a huge stone building was erected, consisting of many chambers, thousands of rooms and transitions with overlapping gigantic slabs. From the whole building there were only vague tracks and scattered debris, but still the Greeks marveled at it no less than the Great Pyramids. Later, the Greeks called it labyrinth. The structure was lost, and now it is difficult to determine what it really was, but it is possible that it was a royal memorial temple with special offices for the gods of Names. Apparently, by uniting the deities of the Names in one temple around the king's person, they wished to tie the Names themselves to the general Egyptian pharaonic power. It is important to note that with the accession of Amenemhotep III, the chain of the Namarch tombs, until then uninterrupted, is suddenly suppressed. Apparently, Amenemhotep III managed to break the power of the Namarches. This, however, did not destroy the complex social contradictions that tore the society of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. We have already said that, as the monuments show, both the pharaohs and the local nobility were always in alarm. Enemies or rebels constantly threatened their authority. With the sharpness of social contradictions, with the instability of the political situation in the country, it was enough to shake the state power slightly, so that all contradictions would be revealed with great force. After Amenemhotep III, the last and only time king of the Middle Kingdom, somehow reminiscent of the powerful pharaohs of the ancient kingdom, on the throne flashed two short-lived rulers, of whom the second was a woman, and the Xii dynasty ceased. Ideology and culture of the Middle Kingdom period. Religion, writing and scientific knowledge. The language spoken during the Middle Kingdom was comparatively close to the language of the Old Kingdom, but a new fluent letter, the so-called hieratic, which was written on papyrus and used in everyday life, was already very different from the ancient fugitive letter. By the time of the Xii dynasty, along with the fluent book letter, a real business crook was developed, not at all like the old business handwriting, and even more so on their common progenitor, a hieroglyphic letter. The last was a letter for inscriptions. The development of writing is an indicator of the significant successes of Egyptian culture during the Middle Kingdom. The general upsurge of economic and social life during the Middle Kingdom beneficially affected the development of science. It is to the Middle Kingdom that several lists of task books belong, although in view of the destruction of the books of the ancient kingdom it cannot be established how much the descendants were ahead of their ancestors. The average Egyptian counting and surveying science, in spite of the extreme bulkiness of the formation of fractions, solved complex problems, manipulated the notion of the unknown, the number mt, which they considered equal to 3.16, calculated the volume of the truncated pyramid and, possibly, the hemisphere's surface. These achievements, attested in the manuscript of the end of the Middle Kingdom, kept in the State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, speak of the high development of mathematical knowledge. From the Middle Kingdom also came the remnants of a medical manual for female diseases and an anesthetic for animals. By the end of the Middle Kingdom is a kind of reference book, the exact purpose of which is not clear. It contains a list of over 300 names of various oils, birds, animals, plants, bread, grain, body parts, Ethiopian fortresses, Upper Egyptian cities. It also includes abbreviated designations of 20 species of livestock. Beliefs. The deification of the Tsar's power remains, as before, the most important of the devil's religion. Xii dynasty advanced the cult of the new state god, Amun. The center of the cult of Amun was at that time the city of Thebes, in the north of the Theban nome. Amun, who, for giving a more weight, was attributed something from the Upper Egyptian god of Mina's fertility, was identified with the ancient state god of the Sunday, Ra, under the name Amun-Ra. In connection with the growth of the importance of the middle strata of the population, certain changes are taking place in religious beliefs. The simple free ones declared loudly about themselves, and the state cult reflected in themselves their moods. Amun-Ra begins to be portrayed caring for the most insignificant creatures, noting the beggar's plea, saving the timid from the proud, judging between the wretched and the strong. Thus Amun-Ra is portrayed in the glorification, which is fully known from the manuscript of the New Kingdom, mid-Xi dynasty, and from passages preserved from the period of the end of the Middle Kingdom. At the same time, it is natural that the doctrine of Amun, as a defender of the poor, was a means of ideological influence of the ruling class on the broad masses of the population. The same Xi dynasty, which put forward Amun, contributed a lot to the exaltation of the god Osiris. After the fall of the Old Kingdom, the images and inscriptions from the walls of bulky tombs of the nobles migrated to modest slabs, accessible to people of moderate means. There were many such slabs in the cemeteries. Part of the verbose spells from the royal pyramids appeared on the walls of wooden coffins, available to wealthy people. Here, new, so-called, inscriptions of sarcophagi were attached to these spells, as well as spells included in the New and Late Egyptian funeral collections, the so-called Ancient Book of the Dead. Now every deceased person could be considered Osiris, having the magic of his advantage to exist in the afterlife. Osiris became the general god of the gods of the dead. The importance of his city of Abydos and of the sacred representations that were being held there increased. Xi dynasty took into account all this and contributed in every way to the splendor of the Abydos festivities. Architecture. With the reunification of the country, the stone building, large and bold, again does not flourish, although it does not resemble the architecture of the ancient kingdom. The funerary construction of one of the pairs of the Shi dynasty, Mentukhotep in Thebes, near present-day Deir el-Bahri, was a bizarre combination of a memorial temple, a pyramid and an Upper Egyptian cave tomb. The middle part of the building was a natural rock, topped, apparently, by a pyramid. It was surrounded on the outside by two tiers of porticos with faceted posts. The kings of the Xi dynasty, as already mentioned, in their struggle against the local nobility, the nomarchs relied on the service noblemen's nobility and warriors and sought outwardly to restore the order of the ancient kingdom. Characteristically, Amenemhat I settled not far from Memphis, where the traditions of the ancient kingdom lasted longer. Return to the antiquity of the Xi dynasty was and the refusal of the royal tombstones in the spirit of the Shi dynasty. On the edge of the desert from the southern outskirts of Memphis to the entrance to the land of the Lake Fayum oasis and in the very wilderness one after another the royal pyramids grew. Outwardly they were like ancient pyramids, with memorial temples in the front, and even with the tombs of the nobility around, near the present villages of Dakhshur, Lisht, El-Lehan, Hawar. In fact, however, the pyramids of the Xi dynasty, with the exception of Senuserdai, were built of raw bricks and only lined with limestone. Yes, and in Senusert the pyramid consisted only of stone stands, covered with sand and gravel, only outside covered with limestone facing. The tombs of the nobles near the pyramids also had the appearance of mounds, mastaba, but were built of bricks and were only lined with limestone slabs. The Upper Egyptian tombs carved in the rocks were richer, especially the tombs of the Nam arches. Sometimes these tombs consisted of several rooms and passages, with room for the statue of the deceased in the depths, with the crypt under the floor, several stone columns inside, and even under a canopy at the entrance, and with multicolored murals on the walls. What remains of the then urban churches speaks of their simplicity and grace, but not the significance of their size. The gate towers, the pylons, that make up the distinctive feature of the later Egyptian temples go back to the Middle Kingdom. Before the temple, at least in the city of Heliopolis, already at the Xii dynasty, stood two sharp-pointed faceted pillars, an obelisk. Compared with previous times, we are fairly well informed about the civil architecture of the Xii dynasty. Above we already mentioned the city near the Czar's pyramid near the present El Lahan. Impressive constructions were the fortresses erected at the Xii dynasty from the Second Nile Rapids. Art. At that time, a new spirit was breathing in the fine arts. The pride in his skill shows in each word a lengthy inscription compiled during the Shi dynasty by one of the master in his craft. I knew the gait of the male image and the steps of the female, the position of the bird and cattle, posture, how the eye looks at the other, how to fill the fear of the face of prisoners, enemies, raising the hand of the one who hits the hippopotamus, the pace of the fleeing man. Despite the temporary decline in performing skills during the fall of the Old Kingdom, the liberation of local creative forces from the power of stagnant metropolitan art was beneficial, as it pushed the way for independent searches, observations and studying reality in place of following the ready-made words and school habits. A great achievement of the Middle Kingdom was the development of the painting. The Upper Egyptian rulers who have now moved out have carved tombs in the rocks. Sometimes the walls of the tombs were covered with relief, but the limited means, as well as the fact that the walls of the caves were little adapted for carving images on them, predisposed to the painting of the tomb walls. If the painting before was reduced more to the coloring of the images carved on the wall, now it could fully use its possibilities, giving a more lively and expressive transfer of reality. Subtle observation, in spite of the conventionality of the techniques, distinguished the best painters and sculptors of the Middle Kingdom not less, if not more than their predecessors in the ancient kingdom. Even with the Shi dynasty in the tombs of the Nam arches near the present Beni Hassan there are, for example, amazing in the number, variety and accuracy of the image of military exercises. Remarkable by their liveliness are also groups of wooden figures from the beginning of the Middle Kingdom depicting workers or soldiers of the deceased. The temporary loss of performing skills after the fall of the Old Kingdom was a repairable matter. After the restoration of the unity of the country, the samples of fine arts were no worse than the best examples of the ancient kingdom, and sometimes surpassed them. True, among the things, for example, funerary plates, there are also low-quality ones. Even in the best tombs, the images were not so consecutively merged into one artistic whole with the walls, as in the tombs of the ancient kingdom, but this drawback was bathed in the novelty and vividness of the design and presentation, and also by the special subtlety in the display of animals and birds. New achievements in art related to some involvement in the public life of the broad masses of the free population were reflected in the work of the masters working at the court. True and expressive are many of the sculptures of Senusert and Amenemhat. Their faces, bony, harsh and haughty, were depicted as they seemed to be in reality. Fiction. We get a clear idea of the literature of the ancient Egyptians for the first time with the appearance of the monuments of the Middle Kingdom, although it certainly goes back to the ancient kingdom. and only because of the death of sources can this be shown clearly. In the chapter on the ancient kingdom, it was already mentioned that several writings on worldly wisdom were later attributed to his sages. A fragment of the instructions of the Prince of Hardefeld, preserved in the list of the New Kingdom, is written in a language really different in antiquity. The name of Hardefeld was well known to the Middle Kingdom. In the manuscript of this time we received the instruction attributed to other ancient sages. Taktep, a contemporary of the V dynasty, the father of the dignitary Kagamni, of the time of the Third Dynasty. However, in the literature of the Middle Kingdom there were not only ancient names. Aktoyas, teaching to his son schoolboy with bureaucratic complacency, mocked all kinds of work, except for the profession of a scribe. Two other teachings were essentially political treatises. They were composed in the name of experienced fathers of worldly experience and addressed to their successors. In a more extensive of these teachings, the teaching of the Heracleopolis king to his son Merikar included an artistic description of the world-forming activity of the sun and his concern for humanity. However, in the main, these are the instructions for governing the state. The bitterness left by the experience is especially expressively conveyed in a lesson embedded in the mouth of the founder of the 12th dynasty of Amenemhotep and content. The proposed instructions are wholly engendered by the turbulent times of the Middle Kingdom. Individuals also performed with the same kind of didactic works. Treasurer Amenemhotep III, left an inscription that taught how profitable the service to Pharaoh and how bad the consequences of rebelliousness to him. Teachings Shetepibra can be called a hymn to Pharaoh. The glorification of the pharaonic authority is also inserted in the story of the Sinuheta, one of the works most appreciated by the Egyptians. According to its general construction, this story adjoins the life descriptions of the times of the 6th dynasty, but on the thoroughness and liveliness of the exposition it infinitely exceeds the ancient models. It is possible that we are dealing here with actual incidents, only transmitted in an artistic form. The troubled time of the Middle Kingdom is reflected in the content of this story. The court Sinuhet runs from the military camp, fearing the unrest that may arise when the rulers change. Then he acquires position and wealth in Syria. After his return many years back to his homeland, affectionately received a new pharaoh. Senuserdai especially colorfully described the flight into the desert, single combat with the Syrian knight, and the reception of the fugitive at the court. It is possible that the ancient kingdom was based on a series of fairy tales about Cheops and sorcerers, which reached us in the list of the end of the Middle Kingdom, but, unfortunately, without beginning and end. One by one the princes tell Cheops about the magical deeds of the sorcerers who lived under his predecessors, how one sorcerer punished the unfaithful wife and her lover, as the other magician turned the lake to get the thing dropped by the court beauty. A well-known sage, Prince Hardefeld, offers Cheops a wizard named Jedi, but the wizard, after appearing, grieved the king with a prediction that in several generations power will pass to another kind. Although in fairy tales we are talking about long ago times, but the whole situation proves to be very topical for the Middle Kingdom. In the clash of a wizard dignitary with a lover belonging to people, small, they see a reflection of the struggle between the nobility and the ordinary free. Another modern magician is the rich fellow himself. He behaves to the highest degree independently before Cheops and even teaches the king. Far voyages to overseas countries are reflected in the tale of the shipwrecked man. Travel to the South Krasnamari was made in the ancient kingdom, and then they could already write fairy tales about them. A fairy tale about such a journey of the Middle Kingdom, kept in the hermitage, tells that it was not some dignitary, but a mere mortal was thrown to the island to a terrible, but good-natured snake, taken from there by an Egyptian ship and brought to the court. For the gifts brought from the serpent to the king, he was made into bodyguards. The social contradictions of the Middle Kingdom are expressed especially strongly in the tale of the eloquent villager. In the days of the Heracleopolis kings, a peasant from the oasis to the capital is sent to buy bread. but on the way he is robbed by the servant of an important nobleman. The nobleman remains deaf to the victim's complaint, but when he observes that the complainant is eloquent, he makes him pronounce long accusations and exhortations, which he then writes down for fun to the steamer, a lover of eloquence. In the end, however, the king relented. He rewards the offended and punishes the robber. If everyday stories, such as the story of the misadventures of the eloquent villager, could have been composed by the people in the ancient kingdom, then the artistically constructed speeches scourging the unrighteous dignitary were probably a new kind of literature. These speeches bring us close to that branch of the Middle Egyptian script, which can be considered wholly caused by the profound social upheavals of the Middle Kingdom. The most abstract of such works is the so-called Talk of the Disappointed with His Soul. Having disposed of in an evil and soulless society, the sufferer seeks death. The soul discourages him, pointing to the futility of hopes for a posthumous existence and advises to enjoy life. However, a person does not give up. The soul acts in this work as the bearer of moods, expressed in the Egyptian song of the time, who invited to indulge in everyday pleasures until death came. There are not even the tombs of the glorious sages left. It is said in the song, "What is in the next world? There is no one to tell about it, since no one came back from there." This work is probably the oldest known monument to free thinking, which cast doubt on the prevailing religious doctrine, political literature and the uprising of the lower classes of Egyptian society. Hints of events taking place in public life are also contained in another conversation, the time of the mid-12th dynasty, this time in a conversation between a man and his heart. It is led by an ordinary priest from Heliopolis. In the country there are changes, the year is not like the other. The country is sick, there is no order in it, life from year to year is more difficult, everywhere grief, cities and towns are mourning, everyone creates untruth. The third exposer narrates about historical events in the life of the country, in the so-called Ipuser's Conception Old Reading, Ipuavira. His long, sometimes poetic speech is given for a speech delivered before the king, portrayed as the instigator of the riots. These disorders, a formidable uprising of the lower classes that turned everything around in the country. The culprit describes the coup as darkly as possible in order to then call for the restoration of the old order, which he praises in rapturous words. The author is a representative of the nobility who suffered from the insurgents. One list of the changes taking place in the country seems to him enough to cause indignation among the listeners. The country turned over like a potter's wheel, he says. The poor have become rich, the wealthy have not. The rich are crying, the poor are in joy. Whoever looked for bulls for plowing became the master of the herd. He who has no grain, he himself lends it. Who did not make himself a sailor, became the owner of ships. The former owner looks at them, but they are no longer his. Who did not have a loaf, he became the owner of the bins. His bakery is provided with the property of another, the owners of the clothes, in the pastures. And who did not weave for himself, became the owner of a thin canvas. Who could not build himself a coffin, became the master of the burial vault. The owners of the same clean places, tombs, are thrown to the ground. Dependent people became masters of people. All slaves became insolent in their speeches. The necks of the slaves are covered with jewels. Who was on the premises sends another. Noblemen found themselves in a bakery. The nobles are hungry, they run. The children of the nobles are smashed against the walls. The son of a noble person does not differ from the indigent. The cities say, "Let us remove the strong from our midst." Officials are dispersed throughout the country. Laws are thrown out, and they are trampled underfoot. Insignificant people roam back and forth along the main courts. The chamber is opened, the lists of honor are withdrawn. The Tsar's warehouses and the Egyptian dwelling became the property of any. The Tsar's abode was suddenly defeated. A handful of lawless deprived the country of royal power. What the pyramid concealed, It's empty. The king was taken out of her by insignificant people. Charms are revealed, ordinary people know spells. Small people are repeatedly mentioned in this manuscript, but the driving force behind the coup is insignificant people. The main blow was struck in the capital. In the middle of the speech, the verse after the verse begins with a cry, "Destroy the opponents of the abode of the honest." The capital was then in or near Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt is constantly in mind, whereas Upper Egypt is mentioned only casually, as if it were ruined or as not paying taxes. The culprit complains of the dominance of foreigners who flooded the country and even acquired mastery from artisans of Lower Egypt. When did all these events occur? The speech of the accuser is known to us from the damaged and incomplete list kept in Leiden, Holland. The list was made in the middle of the New Kingdom, but the composition itself on language and content, undoubtedly, goes back to the middle. In the State Hermitage, in Leningrad, another manuscript is kept, the older, but also the New Kingdom, which is the only complete list of another work relating to the same events. The story about them is embedded in the mouth of the priest Neferti, old reading, Nefereku. Historical events are outlined here in brief in the form of a prediction made allegedly to the Tsar of the 4th dynasty of the Snefer. The emphasis in this prediction is not so much on turning worthless people into lords of wealth, but rather as domination in the country of foreigners. The original of this work ascended to the same Middle Kingdom. The predictor was an important priest, a small man, strong with his own hand and a rich man. He was also a supporter of the old order, but he looked further than the denunciator in the Ibizar's convocation. He only dreamed of restoring the old order. The prophet Neferti directly predicted the coming from the south of the reigning king, named Amini. Amini was an abbreviation from Amenemhet, the name of the founder of the Xii dynasty and several subsequent kings. To what interval of time should be attributed the victorious uprising of the lower classes against their enslavers, is not yet known. There are a number of serious arguments in favor of attributing it to the time preceding the reign of the Xii dynasty, but some scholars refer it to the time of the end of the Middle Kingdom. Either way, the uprising of the lower reaches reached the power and scope that we would not have suspected if we did not have these Egyptian monuments. The end of the Middle Kingdom. We saw that the period of the XXI dynasties was a period of serious internal shocks in the history of Egypt. But the Xii dynasty, by the time of which the Middle Kingdom flourished, could not unite Egypt firmly. Weakening of the Egyptian state. After the Xii dynasty, Manetho called one dynasty from Nabis and one dynasty from Zosa in the western part of the delta, Xii and Xiv in the account. A severely damaged royal list, written during the New Kingdom period and kept in Turin, listed after the Xii dynasty a great many royal names, of which only a part was found on the monuments of that time. This is not surprising. The length of the reigns, when it can be installed on scraps of the Turin list, does not exceed usually only a few years, even months or days. The throne became a toy in the hands of the fighting forces. The kings overthrew one after another. Some kings directly called their non-communal parents, others and on the throne retained names that sounded absolutely not royally. How to draw a line between the Xii and Xiv dynasties, whether they followed one another or the Xiv dynasty coexisted simultaneously with Xii and subsequent in some corner of the delta, a question unclear. However, some of the Xii dynasty's pariah left large statues, detailed inscriptions, even traces of construction activity. Egyptian statehood of the Middle Kingdom in the form as it was formed by the end of the Xii dynasty continued to exist even under the Xii dynasty, despite the distemper. This disintegration of the country that followed the ancient kingdom, now it did not happen again. Moreover, the nomarchs did not regain even the position they had before Amenemhet III. To meet the tomb of the nomarch in the spirit of the Xii dynasty can be, with the Xii dynasty, except as an exception. Excavations in the Phoenician city of Biblical prove that there the Xii dynasty retained its influence. Apparently, until the end of this dynasty and northern Ethiopia remained under Egyptian power. Hyksos' domination in Egypt. A mortal blow to a weakened state was inflicted from the outside. At the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt was conquered by the newcomers from the east, whom Manetho called Hyksos. It is possible that behind this name of the conquerors lies the self-designation of the alien kings, rulers of foreign uplands. The tribal composition of the conquerors could be variegated. The names of some Hyksos kings included Semitic words. Over time, the Hyksos kings were already playing the role of pharaohs. They accepted their title. They were called the sons of the sun and declared themselves worshippers of the Egyptian gods. The latter, however, they managed to do poorly, because they clearly preferred their new state god, who, although in the name of Egypt, Seth, but was, perhaps, only identified with him as a foreign deity. One of the places of worship of Set was located just in the east of the delta, where the conquerors mostly settled. Later, in the New Kingdom, it was customary to call the Syrian and Manasian gods Sets. Foreign domination lasted not less than 108 years. A century later, after the expulsion of the Hyksos, in the first half of the 16th century BC, temples were ruined in the country, and up until the time of the Manifesto, there lived a legend about the Hyksos invasion as a terrible pogrom. But under the foreign yoke the spiritual life did not die out in the country, and the Egyptians managed to pass the legacy of the Middle Kingdom to a new period. Thus, one of the most remarkable scientific manuscripts, a large counting book, is marked by the year of the reign of one of the Hyksos kings. His capital Hyksos made Avaris in the east of the delta. To unite Egypt under their power, they really could not. Above the Bees and neighboring regions reigned Egyptian Bets, Sidi, judging by their poor monuments, but as if all the same independent. Only two Hyksos kings, Kion and Appi, extended their power, perhaps even to the south of Egypt, because there were found signs and stones with their names, the latter, about 100 kilometers south of the Bees. It is not known whether the conquerors overthrew the southern royal dynasty or whether it continued to exist under their primacy. Be that as it may, at the end of the Naxian rule in the Bees, there were wagers, which are usually considered the 17th dynasty. XV dynasty or Hyksos. Regarding the XVI dynasty, it is unclear whether it was Hyksos or Theban. The surviving extracts from Manetho on this issue diverge. From the 17th dynasty begins a stubborn struggle for the expulsion of foreign invaders from the Nile Valley, a struggle that marks the beginning of a new era in the history of Egypt, the period of the New Kingdom.